Hi, everybody. The time has come for me to talk about our big research project in this class. I've been kind of hinting at it here and there, saying it has something to do with maybe with conspiracy theories. It actually is more to do with the concept of denialism, which we are going to be reading about in the first two readings of this week. Now, you can use the two readings that I provide this week as some of the readings in your research paper, as well as the article I provided the week before for the midterm about conspiracy theories, if that's relevant to the topic that you choose. You will need to have a minimum of 6 sources for your research project, though, and at least 2 of those need to be peer-reviewed sources. So peer-reviewed sources, if you're not familiar with that, have a look for a page where I will be talking about what a peer-reviewed source is. You'll be able to access those through the library databases like EBSCOhost or Gale databases. And when you're doing searches for source material, if you just check the box peer-reviewed, you can be sure that some of those are peer-reviewed. The one that I do provide called Denialism, What is it and How Should Scientists Respond? That one is a peer-reviewed source. And really all of our sources throughout the semester before the midterm were peer-reviewed sources. Everything for Essay 1 and 2 that I provided, those were scholarly peer-reviewed sources. So it's not a new thing that you will be reading. You have read peer-reviewed sources before in this class. So keep that in mind. So I want to talk about the concept of denialism and what it means. The midterm topic, when we got into conspiracy theories and why people believe them, it's relevant to this topic of denialism. It kind of starts to flow into it. I have a bit of a presentation, so let me share my screen. Okay, so denialism and its fallacies. What you're going to be doing in essay number 3 in the research paper, a longer essay, you are going to be choosing a denialist claim and you are going to be refuting it. This is it's of the types of claims I talked about in the beginning. There was one that was mentioned with the definition claim, claims of fact and definition. So the definition claim was kind of like a fact claim because you are arguing that it was a fact that this is how people should define the term fake news. Like, this is what fake news is kind of a fact claim. It's a claim in which you are arguing that something is a fact. I'm calling this essay a fact claim because in order to refute denialists, most of the time you are arguing that something is true that denialists are saying is not true, or something did happen that denialists are saying did not happen. Really what we're talking about here, though, is thinking critically, seeing logical flaws for what they are, seeing poor argumentation in denialist arguments, and being able to refute them by picking their arguments apart or demonstrating why their arguments don't hold water. So what is denialism? Denialism, I would say, is the ultimate symptom of the post-truth era that I've been talking about in this entire class. Denialism, it has been around for a long time. In fact, one of the papers that I provide to you will give you examples of denialist claims throughout history. Now, some that I mention, like for example, flat earthers or anti-vaxxers, they are not a new thing. There was an anti-vaccination league a long time ago. Like, some of these go back to the 19th century, more than 100 years ago. Same with the Flat Earth Society, right? Of course, a lot of people think, oh yeah, the flat Earth, the belief in the flat Earth goes back, all the way back to this time, to Columbus. Well, that's a myth. People were well aware that the Earth was round, even during Columbus's time. He didn't discover that. It goes back into prehistory, and that is something that you want to look into. Now, just because people have figured out that the Earth was round long before the Common Era, before, back before the turn of they used to say BC and AD, and now they say BCE for before the Common Era, and CE for the Common Era. So before year zero, people had figured out the Earth was round, but that didn't stop people from claiming that it might have been flat. So yeah, denialism has been around for a long time, but what we see today is that it's spreading more widely. It is spreading online in such a way more people are being drawn into it because of mass media, and more than just mass media, because of the internet, because of the information superhighway, because of social media, and because there's this certain phenomenon in social media that we talked about in essay 2. One of the readings talked about filter bubbles or echo chambers, how people surround themselves with people who believe the same thing as them. So if you are curious about, what are these people saying about flat Earth, and you join some Flat Earth Society Facebook group or something, and then you just hear all of these people agreeing about how the Earth is flat and everyone else is wrong, you start to think, because all you're getting is the echoes in this echo chamber, and it filters out, this filter bubble filters out anything that they disagree with, then it becomes easier to fall in to this denialist way of thinking and to start to believe denialist claims. Denialism, like many of our topics in this class, it ends up becoming a definition issue, which is why I started with a definition argument in the beginning of the class. Denialism, if you were to define it, you could define it negatively. What it's not skepticism. Denialists like to present themselves or depict themselves like they are just good skeptics that think for themselves and they're free thinkers, or they're not denialists when it comes to history. They are revisionists, and they're just thinking harder about certain historical ideas or facts than the rest of the scientific community or the rest of historical scholars are. But the difference here between denialists and true skeptics is that denialists are not seeking the truth, and they will bend over backwards not to accept the truth, not to accept the consensus view. Now, when we talk about consensus, this means, what does everyone agree on? So scientific consensus would be, what do the majority of publishing scientists and scientists working in the field, experts, what do the majority of them, the vast majority, say about something like vaccination, like climate change? A skeptic would be convinced by the great amounts of evidence that have convinced so many, the vast majority. And yet a denialist goes out of their way to build elaborate systems of thought and reasoning in order to say something is not true, even though maybe they know that it is true. It's different than the idea of just denial, being in denial. Sometimes we are in denial. It's one of these stages of grief. Dabda is the first stage of grief: denial, anger, bargaining. Can't remember what the second D is, and then acceptance is the last one. So denial, being in denial, is just like an unconscious defense mechanism. You don't want to accept something that is challenging or that makes life difficult or upends your worldview or things like that. Denialism is different than being in denial because it's more structured and more elaborate. You see denialists build their own version of a scholarly study. They build their own corpus, their own body of work, so that they can try to act like there is not consensus. Even though the vast majority of scientists believe one thing, they'll say, no, there isn't agreement, because look at what we have put together, even though there is really agreement about a lot of topics. in that way, they may be dealing with things, they may be denying things in a more conscious way than someone who's just in denial. So it's important to make that distinction. And one of our readings is going to argue that this is evolving. The idea of denialism is evolving because today, what one of the writers calls in post-denialism, it's not even a matter of pretending to lay out your argument in an academic or scholarly way, pretending to have strong evidence to back up what you're saying as a denialist claim. Now it seems like you can just say something's not true. We're in the post-truth era where someone can just yell fake news and they don't have to back that up at all. And there are a lot of people who will say, oh, so-and-so said it was fake news, so I guess the moon landing wasn't real because so-and-so said that was fake news. We are moving past the age when denialism was a complicated thing. And this is why it is, go back, I'm not ready for this slide yet. This is a way that you can appeal using kairos and the timeliness of this idea of denialism. It's more important than ever to deal with denialism in this post-truth era before it gets out of control, right? So a typology, like one of our first readings talked about a typology of fake news. A typology is different than a definition. A definition says, here's my category, here are the criteria to fit into the category. A typology says, here are some examples of types of something, right? So here are some types. Science denial is a type of denialism. Historical negation is a type of denialism. And there are some conspiracy theories that kind of fit into the denialist the denialist category. But you're going to see almost all of these rely on conspiracy theory. It's one of the characteristics, maybe one of the criteria for defining something as denialism. But these are topics you could choose from in your research paper. You could talk about climate change denial. You could talk about flat earth theory. These two are popular. So is anti-vaccination. These are all forms of science denial. Denial of evolutionary theory, or creationists, denial of HIV. Some of you probably have never heard of the fact that there are some people who deny that that AIDS exists, or that HIV causes AIDS, or that antiretrovirus drugs actually help AIDS victims, AIDS sufferers. Denial that smoking causes cancer. This is something that big tobacco companies engage in. There are even people who deny germ theory and suggest that our entire idea of how diseases spread might be false. Actually, there's a very famous person that some suggest has engaged in germ theory denialism, the comedian Bill Maher, although he denies that himself. In fact, what you'll find is, as you look into these, most of the time denialists don't like to be called denialists because it has become something of an insult that will ruin someone's career, right? So there have been, for example, Holocaust deniers. This is an example of historical negation. There have been Holocaust deniers who take people to court and sue them for calling them denialists. In this case, the Holocaust denier lost that case, and they basically proved in a court of law multiple times that the Holocaust did happen as historical consensus says it happened. A historical negation is different than science denial. It's like saying there's this thing that all historians agree happened and happened in a certain way, but all of the historians are wrong. So there's Confederate revisionism. This is also known as the myth of the lost cause, that tries to, you may have heard this idea before, that the South only fought the Civil War over states' rights, when in fact it's very clear that they fought it over their ability to use slave labor in their economy, right? It's a nice way to whitewash it after the fact, to say, no, it wasn't really about slavery, it was about states' rights. And we were actually pretty honorable, noble, it was a noble fight, and we were actually kind of the good guys, and we were being victimized by the North. Well, that's revisionism. But really, more than revisionism, because historical revision is something that all professional historians engage in, but they do it with real facts and evidence, not just by twisting things and making arguments that rely on poor evidence, which we're going to see the kind of hallmarks of denialism. A denial of war crimes or human rights abuses. This is pretty common. You know, Stalin engaged in this a lot, denying what his regime did as far as massacres, things like that. The Tiananmen Square massacre, China to this day acts like it did not happen, and even though we have photographic evidence of it. The moon landing, so the people saying this is a pretty popular one. Students like to write about the moon landing being a hoax, that the moon landing didn't happen. This is a way to negate history and say this history that we all accept happened didn't actually. This is why I'm wearing a NASA shirt while I do this, because of flat Earth theory and because of the moon landing hoax. Then, I mean, moon landing hoax, it gets into conspiracy theories suggesting that NASA is involved in a cover-up, right? So there are other conspiracy theories, though, that you could suggest they don't fit as well into the other categories. The 9/11 truther movement, it's kind of like historical negation, saying something didn't happen the way we think it happened, although it's pretty recent history. Same with birtherism, trying to claim that Obama wasn't born in the United States. We're talking about things that have been disproven, like claims, 9/11 truther claims about Building 7 and what caused it to fall, that it was a controlled demolition, which has been refuted by the Bureau of, or the National Institutes of Standards and NIST. I can't remember the entire acronym. And then there are anti-Semitic canards, the idea of a worldwide Jewish conspiracy that have generated all kinds of absolutely nuts conspiracy theories about, for example, Jewish people just love, the idea that they loved crucifying Jesus so much that they will steal communion wafers, because communion wafers are supposed to be the body of Christ, and they will steal them just to stab them, and because they want to desecrate the host, it's called. Or the idea that they will reenact the crucifixion of Christ by kidnapping Christian kids and ritually murdering them. That's called the blood libel. Those are ancient ones that have been disproven. More recent ones are, well, when the Black Death ravaged Europe, Jews were blamed, and they said they poisoned wells, right? They were used as scapegoats, but there's this conspiracy that Jews are involved in spreading disease purposely for whatever reason, or that they control certain industries, etc. All of these have been disproven and argued against convincingly, and yet, in this case, because of racism, they continue to go on. In fact, there have been people, blaming the spread of coronavirus on Jews recently. So these are some conspiracy theories that not all, I'll say this, not all conspiracy theories really engage in denialism. You're talking about conspiracy theories that purposely ignore evidence that has come to light that disprove what they're saying. There are other conspiracy theories like, the death of Jeffrey Epstein, right? They're not really ignoring certain evidence that disproves their idea that he was killed or murdered instead of committing suicide. That's just, maybe eventually there will be evidence he did commit suicide, and then if they ignore it because they want to keep believing it was murder, then it could possibly be a form of denial. But really, all of these engage in conspiracy theory. That's a major characteristic of this. The moon landing hoax would say that NASA is involved in a cover-up. Holocaust denial, it engages in the idea that this worldwide Jewish conspiracy is trying to get sympathy for Jews by spreading this lie, is what they'll say. Or the denial of war crime, human rights abuses. Often they'll say, oh, it's the Western media or the press, they just try to make us look bad. And so it's kind of a conspiracy theory. Flat Earth theory, again, they say NASA's involved in a cover-up. Anti-vaxxers, they say big pharma is involved in a conspiracy to make people believe that these vaccinations aren't harmful or are doing something different. The climate change, they'll see a conspiracy. Some people have seen it as a conspiracy by China for some reason, because they want to hold back our economy or something like that. HIV/AIDS denial, right? They engage in conspiracy theories about big pharmaceutical companies wanting to sell their antiretroviruses. Denial that smoking causes cancer. They say these big tobacco companies, they'll say that people, their enemies just want to put them out of business or something like that. Let me just take a moment. Okay, just wanted to make sure I was still recording after all that. That would be bad if I wasn't. Okay, so moving on. Characteristics, possible criteria if you were defining it. This infographic is really useful. They if you use the mnemonic device FLICK with 2 C's, they use fake experts, and this is in a way that is trying to make it seem like, even though they're in the minority, or like really nobody believes what they try to say, they'll find someone who's willing to act like an expert, or someone who's an expert. Maybe they have a degree, and so they seem impressive because they have a PhD, but it's not in the correct field, or they, they're willing to take money to join one side, and so it tries to magnify their minority view and say, look, we have experts of our own, and this is similar to this one over here, cherry picking. So yeah, reliance on false authorities. That would be fake experts. This is a logical fallacy in itself, an appeal to a false authority, and it affects their credibility as the people making the argument. Other logical fallacies that they use would be the red herring. That's when you try to just make some sort of a diversion or change the subject from something you don't want to deal with. This happens a lot with denialists. You bring up a piece of evidence and they'll say something, oh, well, what about, this? And they'll change the subject. They misrepresent facts, or they misrepresent what their evidence proved. They jump to conclusions. False dichotomy, they'll say, if it wasn't this, it must have been this, when there might have been any number of other explanations. They create impossible expectations, where they'll say, in order to prove something, you would need to, and their what they require, what they say would be needed in order to prove something. They set the bar so high that no one could ever prove it, and they refuse to look at the wealth of all this other evidence. Like, for example, Holocaust denialists, they say about 3 specific things. One of them is that they'll say, if the extermination of Jews happened at concentration camps, it wasn't like a purposeful thing, and it wasn't from an order signed by Hitler. And even though there's tons of evidence of things that were said by Nazi officials and by Hitler himself in speeches, they're like, well, you can't prove it unless you have an actual order signed by Hitler, right? Even though documents like that were destroyed before the end of the war. So they've created this impossible expectation. And then, yeah, reliance on selectivity. That would be cherry picking. There's a vast amount of evidence that they're wrong, but there's this one thing over here that they could probably try to cause some doubt with that. So that's what they pick on. That's the cherry they pick. Resorting to conspiracy theory, of course, which is something that I just pointed out for almost all of our topics. If you are refuting a denialist, one of the most important things is to actually understand what denialists are saying. I say, know your enemy here. Understand their specific claims. Don't be vague. Don't oversimplify what they're saying. Do your background reading. Background reading is different from finding sources that agree with what you're saying. background reading helps you understand the overall topic, the complete picture of what you're talking about. So if you were writing about, for example, Holocaust denial and those denialists, yes, you would need to understand what Holocaust denialists actually say. If you did some background reading, you would find they don't actually just say the Holocaust didn't happen. They often will say, lots of Jews died, but not as many as 6 million, which is the number that's agreed upon by historians. Or they'll say, Jews that died in the camps, they died because of starvation or, because supply lines were cut off. They weren't systematically exterminated using gas chambers, which we have evidence that they were, but they cast doubt on that evidence. They try to say gas chambers were just used to kill the lice in clothing, even though there's plenty of evidence that that's not accurate either. And then they make this claim about, there's no order from Hitler that I mentioned before. So if you didn't actually do the background reading, then you say something like, well, Holocaust deniers are so stupid, they say it didn't happen, when that's not exactly what they're saying. And so if you hear a real Holocaust denialist and he's not saying the Holocaust didn't happen, instead he's saying, but like, what about, maybe they weren't systematically exterminated, or maybe it wasn't as many as, then you might think, oh, well, they're not denying it didn't happen, and you could fall in for it, right? And if you're trying to argue against them, you want to depict them correctly. You don't want to fall into logical fallacies yourself, like oversimplifying what they say, which would be the straw man fallacy, or ad hominem attacks, where you just attack the person, say how stupid they are or something like that, right? So you need to be able to refute the very specific things that they actually say. Denialists like to get very specific and very technical in their arguments, so you need to understand what their arguments are and how they can be refuted. But you also need to know your topic inside and out, not just what denialists say, what Holocaust denialists say, right? They say these three things, but you may need to have a good, strong understanding of the history of the Holocaust generally. So background reading is pretty deep for a topic like this. And it's important that you do your background reading before you look for strong sources to actually quote from in your paper. So you don't want to be hostile or dismissive. Like I said, you don't want to engage in those ad hominem attacks, right? Their views will be offensive. A lot of these Holocaust denial, it's offensive, right? Or flat earth theory, it's ridiculous. But you're not going to make an effective argument if you just make light of it, if you talk about how ridiculous or stupid they are, or if you talk about how evil they are, right? Because they're not presenting themselves that way, and you could lose some credibility yourself for being disrespectful to them in your treatment of them. Even if you feel like they deserve no respect, when you're treating them, when you're trying to refute an opponent in a debate, you have some modicum of respect in order to maintain your own credibility, right? So when you are doing your background reading and finding out what they say, you have to be careful, and everyone should be aware of this. You have to be careful that you're not taken in by their spiel, by their rhetoric, because like I said, they have a lot of particular arguments. They like to get very technical, and if you don't know the facts, and if you don't recognize the way that they're twisting facts to make their false argument, then you can fall for it. You can fall for what they call the Gish Gallop. The Gish Gallop is this idea that they'll throw a bunch of lies at you, or half-truths, or things like that. And then it will take you so long to sift through all the things, what's wrong with all the different things they said, that some people will give up and say, well, they must know what they're talking about because they're throwing a lot of stuff at me, right? Like this meme says, I can lie faster than you can fact check. Gish Gallop is a debate technique where you say as many things as you can, so lies, half-truths, twisted misrepresentations, so that your opponent has to waste time disproving them, and then they can't catch up. A lie, there's this saying, there's this famous quote, a lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth puts its shoes on. Or another way of saying it, it takes 20 seconds to lie, but it takes 20 minutes to prove that a lie is wrong. So be careful of the gish gallop when you are actually reading, doing your background reading. Find the source of the claims. A lot of times this is an easy way to refute claims or the gish gallop. A lot of times denialists will take a ton of their claims from the same place, and that one source has long been discredited, right? So it's usually pretty easy to discredit. For example, a lot of the claims about Holocaust denial are published by one quote unquote historical revisionist society or something like that, which was founded by a white supremacist neo-Nazi anti-Semite. And just that in itself is a pretty simple way to discredit it as having ulterior motives or an agenda to make, to try to restore the reputation of Nazis or something like that. Look for the conspiracy at its heart. So a lot of times arguments will fall apart if they're made to admit to the conspiracy theory that holds it up. So, for example, the flat Earth theory, the moon hoax, moon landing hoax, things like that. When they rely on conspiracies, there's a simple logical argument that conspiracies on such a grand scale. Don't get me wrong, conspiracies exist. That's my daughter screaming, excuse her. Don't get me wrong, conspiracies do exist, and there have been proven examples of conspiracies, but not vast worldwide conspiracies that thousands to millions of people would have to be in on, and not one of them ever revealed the facts and let it leak to the public. For example, 9/11, truthers, ideas that NASA is hiding all of this stuff, and everyone involved, everyone knows at NASA. So if you went over to the house of someone who worked at NASA for 30 years and retired, that if you got in their face enough, they would eventually admit it. The fact is that these huge, widespread conspiracy theories, they don't hold water as logical theories simply because they're too big. There would be too many people that are keeping this secret. And the fact is someone somewhere along the way would have let the secret slip or would have leaked proof of it. Someone would have had a crisis of conscience and come forward about it. So a lot of times recognizing the conspiracy, all those conspiracies that I mentioned already, recognizing those conspiracies are it's a simple way to refute these denialist claims. When you are making your audience, when you're making your argument to refute a denialist claim, make sure that you know your audience. Who are you trying to convince? You don't want to oversimplify or attack the person, because not only does it make you look like an irrational argument, like you don't have a good argument, so you're just attacking someone, or you don't have a good argument, you can't really answer their claims, so you just change the subject. You don't want it to seem that way. You're also not going to convince the people who are denying things if you tell them to their face that they are evil or that they are ridiculous, right? You have to meet them on their terms. So you don't want to engage in that straw man, which is oversimplifying or misrepresenting their points of view. You don't want to engage in the ad hominem attack. I mentioned that already. At the same time, it may be impossible to convince some denialists, some especially those who have made a career out of engaging in denialism, or who are deep into the culture of denialism, or it's part of some other prejudice that they have, some racist worldview or something like that. Like this infographic says, save your energy, pick your fights, choose who you're trying to convince. Sometimes you can't really convince what this says here. You can't really convince the architects of these denialist claims. They may never change. And some of the deep acolytes, the people who have devoted their lives to believing in something like that, and it's a major part of their worldview, also, they may never change their mind. This may be what you are aiming for here. Others, acolytes, architects, they may be too deep. They may never admit that they were wrong because they've spent too many years invested in those ideas. But if you aim to persuade the undecided, the people who are uncertain, people who are curious about the idea, people who are concerned about it, those are the people who might actually be convinced. And then there are, like this says, the blowhards who are just contrarian people who play the devil's advocate, right? Those people also may be, they may be convinced, but specifically the undecided, right? It's important to talk to them. It's important to try to convince them because that might stop the spread of denialism online. If you can reach people who are undecided, don't really know the facts, and if they went to a denialist Facebook group or web page, you know, they might, if they're just seeing one side of the story, maybe they'll be convinced by the denialists. Those are the people you want to reach, right? So I want to talk about what a strong thesis would look like in this paper. First, some examples of a not a great thesis. I'm going to give an example using the Tiananmen Square massacre, the Tiananmen Square incident. You may have seen photos of the guy standing in front of the tank, right? He's like holding a bag and he's just one person standing in front of a tank. There are other photos that show bodies littering that entire street or lot where that happened. It was here. Tiananmen Square incident happened in 1989 when Chinese soldiers massacred student protesters. Okay, well, this is just a fact. It's true. It's informative. It tells you what the Tiananmen Square massacre was, what the Tiananmen Square incident was, but it makes no claim. It makes no argumentative claim. This is just a fact. In order for you to be, so for example, other things like the earth being flat, no, the earth is round. If your thesis just says, well, the earth is round, that's not a strong argument for this paper. This paper needs to make it clear that there are a group of denialists who claim this isn't true, right? Who claim something, and you are arguing how wrong they are, that they can be refuted, right? So moving on from just an informative statement, the Tiananmen Square massacre really happened. Okay, well, still, it's just saying it happened, right? The word really at least indicates somewhere someone must be saying it didn't really happen. So saying it really happened is kind of on the right track, but this is still not a strong thesis. Despite the fact that the Chinese government denies that it happened, the Tiananmen Square massacre really did occur. Okay, now you're on the right road. You're on the right path because you indicate that there are denialists. The Chinese government denies it happened, but despite that, it really did occur, and you're indicating that you're going to argue against this denialist claim. Okay, this is still just okay though. You've done some background reading into your topic, right? So you can do better than this. You can give some background. What do the Chinese government say when they deny it happened? They just say it didn't happen? No, the Chinese government has tried to erase the Tiananmen Square massacre from memory using propaganda to claim it was an invention of the Western media, but it happened. But it really happened. Okay, so this is better because you're giving some background on what the denialist claim really is. They say, they use propaganda and they say the Western media invented it to make them look like massacre, like a bad regime or something like that. Still, it could be stronger. Why? Because here, where you say, but it happened, it really did occur, it really happened, none of this is indicating what your main points are to prove that it happened, to refute the Chinese government saying it was Western media that made it up. So here's a strong thesis. The Chinese government has tried to erase the Tiananmen Square massacre from memory using propaganda to claim it was an invention of the Western media, but photographic evidence And the testimony of survivors clearly disproved their denialist claims. Okay, so not only have you given background information, given some indication of what the denialists actually say, that it was an invention of Western media, but you also indicate how you're going to prove that they're wrong, that they are denialists, that they are misrepresenting things. Photographic evidence, you're going to talk about that, I assume. You're going to talk about the testimony of survivors, right? You may talk about why they want to make it look like the Western media made it up, talk about their propaganda or something like that. Okay, so hopefully this is helpful to you as you are moving into your final research project in this class. You are going to be writing a little bit longer of an essay because this is a research project and requires more sources. I hope that you search through our library databases for strong and peer-reviewed sources that have to do with your topic. Make sure you do plenty of background reading before you start to find articles that actually you can quote from. And you may find articles that are peer-reviewed and high quality that you can quote from in your paper, but also provide good background reading on what these denialists actually claim. All right, so let me know if you have any questions about this assignment.